Thank you for tuning in to this Beer Guys Radio Extra. We're live at Roswell Beer Festival talking with Ron Smith and Mary O'Boyle, authors of Atlanta Beer, a heady history of brewing in the hub of the South, and Prohibition in Atlanta, Temperance, Tiger Kings, and White Lightning. Ron and Mary will share info on the history of beer and brewing in Georgia, from the first brewery opened in 1738 through to the modern craft beer boom. Both of their books are available on Amazon or directly from their website at atlantabeerbook.com. All proceeds from Roswell Beer Festival go to benefit Starhouse Foundation, providing after-school tutoring and mentoring to at-risk youth. For more information, visit roswellbeerfestival.com or starhousefoundation.org. In Georgia beer history, Ron and Mary, thank you so much for joining us today. We appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you for being here.
Absolutely. So we're going to go through kind of chronological here, and I'm going to start off, Ron, just telling about the first brewery in Georgia. I don't think a lot of people know this story, but Georgia was originally intended to be a colony for debtors, and it was going to be a place where people could come and work off their debt. So, you know, debtors' prisons were a thing. If you were broke, you went to jail. So Georgia was going to be a debtors' colony. So under James Oglethorpe, a military colony was established in Georgia with a very strict set of rules. One of those rules being absolutely no alcohol. Now, the big problem with this is that if there was no alcohol, that left the only beverage as water. And as a lot of us know, one of the reasons beer and other fermented beverages were popular is because water at the time had a lot of bacteria in it, and people in the colony were dying of dysentery because they didn't have any alcohol. So Oglethorpe took a trip to England, and he left command of Georgia to Major William Horton. Now, during the trip, the colonists of Georgia found out that they were the only ones living under such a strict set of rules, and this started a bloodless revolution. And
preferable.
Yes, right. That's the preferred way to have a revolution. So, and the result of this was, one of the results was they got their alcohol. They got alcohol there. So, when Oglethorpe returned from England, he was furious with Major Horton that he broke the rules, and he'd done that. So, but Horton got him calmed down and told him, wait a minute, you're upset, but no one's dying. People aren't dying of dysentery, like on the old Oregon Trail game. They are not dying of dysentery. So that's Oglethorpe realized he was correct, and actually it ended up, Georgia ended up thriving after that. So as part of that, Oglethorpe gave control to what would become Jekyll Island to Major Horton. So, and when Horton originally took control and went to Jekyll Island, he realized it would be a great place for a brewery. So that is where Georgia's first brewery started. In 1738, Major Horton built a brewery on Jekyll Island in Georgia, and that is, as far as we know, Georgia's first official brewery. So the issues with sickness due to drinking the tainted water all but vanished, thanks to the healing power of beer. So it's a beautiful story, isn't it? So that's the first, Georgia's first brewery. And Ron,
have you visited?
I haven't visited. Yeah, I want to get out there because it sounds very interesting.
Yeah, not much left of the foundations of that.
That's
building.
what I figured. Yeah. So just the stories, the legend, right? Yeah. So now, Ron, this is where your expertise comes in. We're going to talk a little bit about pre-Prohibition brewing in Georgia, and I'll just kind of let you go. Most of the cities in Georgia pre-Prohibition, there were breweries, correct?
There were breweries. Most of Georgia's major cities, Augusta, Atlanta, Brunswick, Columbia, Macon, Savannah, all these cities had breweries. In the case of Atlanta, Savannah, and Macon, they had multiple breweries pre-Prohibition. Maybe not at the same exact time. In some cases, Atlanta did. Atlanta had, I believe, if my memory serves me correctly, it's been a while since I've done some of the research, but I believe there's 5 operating at one time in the Atlanta area. But most of the major cities in Atlanta had breweries pre-Prohibition. They were considered, before the temperance movement started, the breweries were considered a huge asset for the city. They were a business And that's the way they look at it. Is, you know, oh, hey, we got this factory, people have jobs, we have beer. You know, what could go wrong? And then...
so we've just recently surpassed pre-Prohibition numbers in Georgia as far as breweries go, correct?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I'm trying to think about what point that we had 20 breweries going on in the state of Georgia. Pretty early on, I guess, in the craft beer revolution, explosion, whatever you want to call it. Yeah, yeah. And then
it took a long time to get there. That's one of the things we were talking about on the way over, is just how long it took to come back.
Right,
and we're talking about the factors that made it so hard for breweries to, with their equipment, compete with the macro breweries. It took a long time to get there.
Yeah, because that was something the macro breweries, they had a lot more power, basically. You know, it was pretty difficult for a small brewery to go anywhere, correct?
Sure. Oh, yeah. Yeah, absolutely. And then, as Mary mentioned, equipment. I mean, now you think about, oh, well, I'll just go to, you know, so-and-so corporation and get my tanks and everything else. Like when, you know, Marthasville is starting off, when Blinddale over next to Athens is starting off, you just don't go, if you do find a company that makes your equipment, it's outrageously expensive, so you have to repurpose equipment. So that's what a lot of early craft breweries did. Is, you know, you may have Pepto-Bismol tanks, you may have dairy tanks,
right? Yeah.
Bottling, old Pepsi bottling lines, things like that. You know, and you put all this stuff together in a Frankensteinian manner and start brewing beer.
Absolutely. Know? So now, early post-Prohibition, there were some breweries during Prohibition, both in. You actually told me this, that people need to realize there was state and national prohibition.
Correct, yeah.
And not every state and national, the times were the same, correct?
Right, yeah.
And Georgia's state prohibition was actually prior to national prohibition, is that right?
Yeah, by quite a long shot. You're talking early 1900s with state prohibition. There's like 2 rounds of state prohibition that comes around even before national prohibition even happens.
Were already more restrictive by the time national prohibition came around.
Right, right. So, but there were some breweries that found creative ways to survive Prohibition, and actually one of the largest early post-Prohibition breweries in Georgia was one that had been operational for a long time prior to that, correct?
Right, yeah. The one that ultimately became the Atlantic Brewery. Basically, during Prohibition, they were making near beer. They basically, you know, canned water. They bottled Coca-Cola during some portions. They also sold coal, because I mean, if you think about it, you know, it's a coal-driven operation anyway, steam and coal. So they sold part of their coal excess to people, and you know, found, my memory serves me correct, the Acme Brewing Company in Macon operated, since they had a lot of ice on hand, they basically operated as a butcher shop for a while. So, you know, you did what you did to, ice cream. Some places did ice cream as well. So.
And even changed their names to remove the word beer, because you wouldn't want to present yourself.
Well, that's, I know with Atlantic Brewing, they went through 5 or 6 names over the course, kind of depending on what they had to focus on at the time, correct?
Yeah, like the Atlanta Ice and Cold Company.
Right.
You know, a different, you know, whatever way. You may or may not be selling beer occasionally, you know, off the record, but you were, you know,
medicinal,
right?
Yeah.
But you had to be creative in all forms or functions. Or you drop off near beer or a malt beverage and drop it off with a couple of buckets and some tubing and you know, packs of yeast, and say, whatever you do, don't put all this together.
Sure, absolutely. Didn't they actually put warnings on there? It's like, warning, if you put this, and this together, it's going to make alcohol.
Yep.
And that's and you shouldn't do that.
You shouldn't do that.
Yes.
Don't cause fermentation.
You got to have the warnings there. It's good that they give you a heads up on that.
Don't follow
Absolutely.
these instructions.
Now, as national prohibition ended, there were some breweries that applied for a brewing license to get started up, but just because of delays within the state of Georgia passing laws and that, some just never came to fruition because of the headaches with the laws, correct?
Yeah, it's in Atlanta, for example, there was Southern States Brewing Limited, I think it was, and then Atlantic Liberty Brewing, and they applied for permits, but once they realized that state prohibition was going to hang around for several more years, possibly indefinitely, you know, they didn't know at the time. They just basically just abandoned the whole concept. So in Atlanta, the only brewery that came all the way through Prohibition and survived was what became known as the Atlantic Brewery. And it stayed in operation until 1955.
So that was nearly 100 years, I believe, for them,
Yeah.
correct? The 1890s?
Yeah.
So nearly 100 years.
It's wild to think about the fact that they're still one of the longest operating companies in Atlanta, even though they've been closed since 1955.
Right,
you know?
absolutely.
It's as they had almost 100 years. They're still.
They got in after Sherman's burn, so they didn't get burnt to the ground there, so that's a good thing. So now that's kind of the next phase of that is, Ron, kind of what I'm calling early craft.
Yeah.
Because there was, I wouldn't say a boom necessarily, but I think it was 78 when Carter approved homebrewing, when homebrewing became legal nationwide. And with that, a few breweries started popping up. And we had a few that kind of went through Georgia, but only major, what we call the macro brewers were in Georgia even until the 1990s. Is that correct?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, you had Pabst Brewery down in South Georgia. You had
talked about Carling, which is
Carling, the Carling, which unfortunately they demoed the Carling building not long ago. Yeah, it's on the south side of town, off of I don't believe it's Connector. I think it's 75, at that point.
And I think the remnants, correct me here, but I think it's the Atlanta Hilton's parking garage.
Correct.
Is where the Atlantic Brewing Company's cellars used to be. Is that correct?
That's correct. Yeah, the part of the brewery building itself sat about where the Hilton is now, and then where you would go down into their cellars. That's where the parking garage is.
Very cool.
And they had their water source there.
Yeah.
That's the other really interesting part.
All right.
Yeah, natural water source. They would pump the heck out of it. Yeah, it's apparently
very cool. Awesome. So we just mentioned, it was the 90s before craft brewing came here, and when you think the grand scheme of things, that's young. We're talking less than 30 years when you have some European, German and Belgian brewers that we're talking hundreds of years. So craft beer in America in general, but Georgia is a young industry. So some of those first ones that kind of came and went, what were some of the breweries that we saw as part of our kind of early first wave craft?
Well, you have in Atlanta, you had Hellenbach up in and around Helen. That's very early on in 1990. And actually, while I'm thinking of it, John Roberts, did you go over and
the Hellenbach?
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah.
It tastes very similar to what I remember.
Did he brew that again this year?
I'm hoping he.
Okay, because that's in what it is Hellenbach beer was one of the first beers brewed by Friends Brewing, the Hellenbach Brewery in up in Helen.
Yeah.
And last year, John Roberts at Max Lagers revived that recipe. They had the Hellenbach Race Series. And the gentleman organizing the Hellenbach race actually hunted down the original Hellenbach brewery owners, and they collaborated with John Roberts at Max Lagers to rebrew that beer. So bring back a little
good
taste of Georgia's history there.
It is. That was some good beer. Actually, fortunately, before they closed down and stopped brewing in around '98, I got to actually try the beer. So it was cool. But yeah, I mean, in Atlanta proper, you had Marthasville. You had the Atlanta Brewing Company, which we now know doing business as Red Brick Brewing. We had Dogwood. Sweetwater popped in there about in '97. Over close to Athens, you had Blind Man Ales. That's one of them that I think falls between the cracks. People don't talk much about it, but you had two home brewing guys hobbling equipment together and making beer. Had these cool taps, handles that look like cows.
Which was a lot of the ways you did it. Like you said, there wasn't a lot of specialized companies making brewing equipment at that time, correct?
Yeah.
So you had to get the dairy tanks and
Yeah.
repurpose them.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I was just going to interject, one of the things that we were talking about, because we were chatting on the way over, is that now we know a lot of the breweries that start up, they buy smaller equipment from other breweries that are upscaling. So there's another source. You don't even have to buy your tanks new.
Right.
People will sort of, there's a market, in other words, where you can go out, get smaller equipment to get going while somebody else is scaling up. These guys didn't have any options like that.
Sure.
They were...
Well, I went to some of those
Toothpaste, you know.
breweries. That's, you know, the ingenuity of these guys to take something meant for a totally different purpose and to make it make beer. If there's a will, there's a way. You know,
Yeah,
they're going to find out a way to
absolutely.
make it happen. So
Absolutely. Yeah, I mean, out of all of that, out of all the, you know, the early startups, and they had lots and lots of challenges because, as Mary said, the infrastructure wasn't there. I think a lot of times the distributors really didn't know how to handle them because, you know, what is this small brewery
Sure.
thing, you know? So between all of that, I mean, you had, you know, Red Brick made it through. The early startup in Atlanta,
and they're actually the current oldest currently operating brewery
Yes.
in the state, being started in 1993.
yes, absolutely, which is pretty cool for it to be here in the city. You know, it's neat. They're not the original building that where they were at, but nonetheless, you know, the company has survived through Sweetwater. Also isn't in their current building, but you know, they survived through the push as well, and they're huge.
Sweetwater had to move so they could take over the block there. So they had to move out. So, and you mentioned Dogwood. So, although some of these breweries have come and gone, a lot of the owners are still around. We
Right.
mentioned Hellenbach. Dal Scoggins
Yep.
actually runs the U.S. Beer Open Championship.
Yep.
And he was one of the original owners, so he's still involved with that. Crawford Moran, that owned Dogwood Brewing, now is co-owner of Five Seasons Westside Brew
Yep.
Pub down there.
Yep.
He had Slice and Pine, he had Five Seasons North, but now his sole operation is Five Seasons there Westside.
Yeah, absolutely. That's actually one of my favorite places to go drink is Five Seasons.
Food's good there too.
Food is good there
food
too.
and beer.
Absolutely.
Locally sourced food, organic,
Yes.
pastured chicken, all the things that make me happy.
That's good stuff.
And
absolutely.
beer.
And beer.
And beer, right.
And yeah,
Exactly.
Crawford wrote the foreword to the Atlanta Beer book that we did.
You know, a lot of these pictures in here, these guys look young.
They did.
From back in the day, talking to some of these brewers, that's, you know, when you look at this, like, you know, Red Brick being 25, Max Lager's turned 20,
Yeah.
you know, this year. So you look at these guys, they've been doing this 20 years. I guess people do age a little bit in 20 plus years.
I know. I think Crawford barely had any gray hair in that picture.
See?
that I took of him.
Right, exactly.
Me as
Absolutely.
well. So.
So when we moved from there, that was kind of early craft. We have a couple that have survived or kind of reborn into modern craft. But looking at this, there was really only a few breweries that opened over the next several years. Like you mentioned, Sweetwater opened around 1997. Sweetwater is now the 15th largest craft brewery in the United States.
It's amazing.
So, you know, they've really grown up. 20 years there. You know, just celebrated their 21st. You know, anniversary. So we have, as I mentioned, Max Lager's just celebrated 20 years. You know, our oldest places are 20, 25, 21 years old. So really, we've only seen a big push here in the last 5, I don't even want to say 10 years. Really, the last 5 or 6 years has been where we've seen the big boom here, correct?
Correct. Yeah. I mean, and it's just been an explosion. I can't even keep up with the numbers. Every time I go, oh, you know, wait a minute, I haven't visited that brewery. Let me make a list of the breweries I haven't visited yet.
Better write that in pencil because you'll have to keep updated.
Exactly.
So, yeah.
I mean, every time I turn around, there's a new brewery opened up, which I think is fantastic. I think Atlanta can, you know, the greater Atlanta area is a huge place. I think we can totally support.
Can I interject something about that? One of my hypotheses as we were writing the book and we were talking about growler shops is that, you know, we could see some come and go, same with the breweries. What I thought would happen, and I'm kind of seeing it with some of the small breweries now, is that they're tapping their community. So
Sure.
it's really interesting. Like some of them I think will always stay small, and I don't have any issue with that because if what they're aspiring to do is brew beer that they love in a place that they built with their hands, you know, we can see places that have this steady community that supports them, and I think that's cool. That goes back to the old days where you take your growler, your pail down to the guy on the corner and fill up your pail with beer and bring it home. So
the original bucket of beer, right?
Exactly.
Yes.
The original growler.
And that's something you mentioned that, supporting local. We see that a lot as you look at these last 25 years of brewing. And if you look nationwide, we're really looking early to late 80s, so maybe 30 years for the craft beer movement in the United States. So craft beer people that were into American beer were into Sierra Nevada, Sam Adams, Stone, New Belgium, these breweries that came out. As that has grown, people became local, and local meant in their state or in their region. But it's going to the place where local now to a lot of people means who's walking distance of my house.
I think that's true. And that's not a bad thing, right?
It's not a bad thing. And a lot more breweries are going to cater to that. Georgia's laws just changed last year. They've changed a couple times over the last couple years, but allowing direct sales from breweries where people could go into a brewery and buy a beer and drink it there or buy some to go. So one thing that's added to the modern craft movement here is breweries are opening what they refer to as own premise, sales, where they don't have any intention to distribute out into the market. They want you to come there and drink the beer there and enjoy it with them there, and that's going to be their focus. And one of the good things about that for the brewer is that a brewer that sells beer at their brewery makes 6 to 7 times as much off of that beer than if they sold it through a distributor. So they're able to keep more of their money, and if they choose to expand more from there. So
it's pretty much like an author selling your own books.
Right, exactly. That's why you get to keep more of your own money there.
Absolutely.
Just some stats. We were talking about kind of the numbers here. Some stats I pulled up before our conversation. Less than 10 years ago, there were only 13 breweries and brew pubs in Georgia. And that's less than 10 years ago. In 2011, there was a boom that we say. We had 5 new breweries opening. So, we're up to 18 as of 2011. By 2013, just 5 years ago, there were 33 breweries and brew pubs across Georgia. Now, this last 5 years has just been a massive boom that we've seen in the state. And as of today, we have nearly 80 breweries and brew pubs across the state. And with a list of new breweries, brew pubs looking to open, we could, by the end of this year or very early next year, be over 100 breweries within the state of Georgia. From 5 years ago, being at 33.
And like we said before we started, we knew that the book was obsolete. We were trying to update statistics in our tables, and we knew it's like, well, at some point you'd have to send the manuscript off. But knowing that by tomorrow it's out of date, because things are moving so fast.
All the pre-Prohibition info is still up to date, right? Yeah. So no changes to that. So,
that's correct. History, hopefully, doesn't change.
So, I think that wraps up most of the questions. We've covered kind of the first brewery in Georgia, the pre-Prohibition, early post-Prohibition. But the bottom line here is craft beer is booming in Georgia. We're seeing more and more local options, and local is becoming hyper-local, where you walk to your neighborhood brewery rather than getting something that was just brewed in the state or in your region. And the styles that are becoming available continues to grow. We had an earlier panel discussion with Roswell's 4 breweries, and each of them brews very unique styles. So if you want a certain style of beer, just within Roswell alone, you can get just about any style that you want. So it doesn't look right now that there's any stopping. There's been predictions that we're looking for a bubble burst, but I think we're just going to see a shift in the dynamic of how these breweries build out. So we're going to see more of the hyper-local. I go to my neighborhood brewery and enjoy it, but I guess the bottom line is Atlanta's and Georgia's beer history is continuing to be written right now.
Absolutely.
Great.
Someday somebody's going to be, collecting those odd aluminum cans with the plastic bands around them. Go, man, wasn't that weird?
You remember back when these were made?
Yeah.
I remember when they did those. Absolutely. Ron, Mary, thank you so much for joining us, sharing your information.
Thank
you for writing the books. They've been a huge help to me. Really appreciate it. And cheers, everybody that's joined us. I'm Tim Dennis with Beer Guys Radio. This is Becky Klein here. Ron Smith, Boyle, authors of Atlanta Beer heady history of brewing in the hub of the South. You can get this on their website, Amazon. Buy from their website, though, because they get to keep more of their money.
And we have a couple with us.
So that's it. And thank you so much, everyone. We appreciate you joining us today. Cheers.
Cheers.
Thanks once again for tuning in to this Beer Guys Radio Extra. For more information, interviews, and insights into the craft beer world, visit beerguysradio.com or subscribe to the Beer Guys Radio podcast on your favorite podcasting platform.